They say in Texas that has the added advantage of being really true. Johnson was once in, I think, 1966, he was calling on Harry Truman, one of the presidents I write about in this book. And, as usual, I guess, like later President Bill Clinton, Johnson was late, and so he gets to Truman's house and goes in, and Johnson says to Truman, "I'm sorry, Mr. President, that I was late," and Truman replied, "Well, if you wanted to be here on time, you would have been." That was Truman. All I can say is I wanted to be on time this morning, but American Airlines intervened. Deregulation, I would point out, came after the time of Richard Nixon, so do not blame him. Before I talk about my book, I should tell about actually the two times I actually was in the presence of Richard Nixon. The first was in 1960 when I was 4 years old. I was growing up in Chicago, and my parents were Republicans. You can imagine they felt pretty lonely in Chicago, especially in that year, 1960. And I don't remember it, but my mother has always told me, and I've checked it out, it's actually true. I was taken to a Richard Nixon motorcade on one of the expressways outside of Chicago that fall. And that was the time, of course, he was running against John Kennedy. And I was 4 years old, and I was held up in the air as his Cadillac rolled by. And that's how I got my start in presidential history. A future president. And my mother couldn't tell me this, but I did a little research later on, and it turns out the reason I was there was that was the fall that some of you remember, and probably most of you know, the future President Nixon was saying, "Elect me and your children will not grow up under communism." And the local Republican leaders wanted little kids held up in the air as examples of the non-communists of the future if Nixon was elected. So I was one of those. And, he was elected 8 years later, and I did not become a communist, so that was well met and well kept. So that was the first time. And the second time was in 1992, 32 years later. I was writing a book with Strobe Talbot on the end of the Cold War, and former President Nixon was kind enough to invite the two of us up to lunch at his house in New Jersey, not the house in Saddle River, but the final house that he and Mrs. Nixon lived in, northern New Jersey. This was February of '92, the cold of winter. As I remember that house, some of you probably know about this, maybe if you were even there, it was in a development called Bear's Nest. And the staff was sort of sensitive because Nixon sometimes called the place Eagle's Nest, and they were worried people would deprecate for that. Ridiculous. So we got there. And the way he did this, I heard from other people who would go to lunch with President Nixon, was, he would do this in a somewhat ceremonial way. He'd spend about an hour in the library at the top of the house. And I think that library is recreated here, isn't it?
Yeah, the study.
Yeah, you see the study. That's the one I'm talking about, with the animals on the upholstery. That's a very sort of French provincial desk. And, you had very much of the sense that this is where he wrote those books and thought a very great deal. So we went up in the elevator. First hour, and one of the problems with being a presidential historian is if you're in the presence of a real president, obviously Tim and I know a million times more about these people than they know about us, or I'll speak for myself, they probably know more about Tim. But the thing is that when you're around them, you have to sort of stifle yourself so that you don't sort of spill out everything that you know. And I'm usually pretty good, but in this case, I saw him when I was 4, and he presided over so much of my childhood and youth. I sort of forgot my usual rules because he took us off the elevator. The first thing I saw was, I don't know if this is in the recreation here in the library, but there was a set of golf clubs leaning against the wall. And I said, "Mr. President, I thought you had given up golf." And he said, "Well, yes, ever since I had a hole-in-one." And of course, I had to rudely interrupt by saying, "Yes, wasn't that in 1961 they put the active ran outside?" Which was correct, but he gave me the weirdest look I've ever had. I said to myself, "Just shut up." So I did, and I was on pretty good behavior for the first hour. And then we went down for lunch in this very nice dining room, I remember, with a gas fire, very nice lunch. And I thought this might be the time to tell him what I hope he would find, this nice story about my having seen him in Cook County when I was 4 years old when he was running against Kennedy. And so I said, "Mr. President, you may not remember me, but we had met before." So I told him the story. And he fell sort of silent, and almost almost immediately changed the subject to something like, well, what do you think of Boris Yeltsin? And for the rest of the lunch did not refer to what I had said about seeing him when I was a kid. And so I went out of the house thinking I had obviously done something extremely rude. And I thought to myself, what have I done? So I called a friend who knew President Nixon pretty well and said, this is what happened, if you can find out what faux pas I made, I'm sorry for it, please tell me what it was. And he called me back a couple days later. He says, well, probably you struck out 3 times. I said, number one, these days President Nixon is interested really in the present and the future, not the past, so you brought up this, what is for him past history. And number two, just in case through some bizarre lapse President Nixon felt like talking about past history, probably the past history he would feel like discussing would not be the 1960 campaign. And strike 3, just in case oddly he wanted to talk about history and the 60 campaign, the place he would really like to discuss would not be Cook County, Illinois. So I guess that there's no general rule that can be pulled out of that except for that even for presidential historians is required some modicum of personal diplomacy, and I certainly didn't follow it that day, but had an absolutely fascinating experience, and it was 2 years before he passed, and one of the most interesting and enlightening experiences of my life. One thing about when you're writing the history of the president, I don't know about it, this happened to Tim, for instance, when he wrote about Kennedy and Khrushchev. I hope he did not come to resemble Khrushchev when he was writing that book. But you begin to resemble the people that you're writing about, and it's a very natural thing because I think Tim will agree that you're thinking about someone 24 hours a day, and you begin to sort of think about the way their minds work. And with the presidents I've written about in this book, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, all that's fine. I also wrote 2 books on Lyndon Johnson, which was a somewhat more mixed experience. And my wife was a little nervous when I was starting this project because she knew that people do become replicas of the person they're writing about. She heard all sorts of things about LBJ. So I thought before starting this thing, I'd do some due diligence and sort of show the 2 people who'd be most affected what their lives would be like if I turned into a living replica of Lyndon Johnson. And so first I went to my assistant. These books were based on these tapes that LBJ made in his private conversations, which Tim is extremely familiar with as a scholar. And I went to my assistant and I thought, well, maybe I should play her a tape of LBJ talking to one of his assistants, or maybe more to the point, screaming at one of his assistants. I had about 800 of those to choose from. So I chose one. Then my assistant put the headphones on her head and heard this screaming voice, and she took off the headphones and said, maybe, Michael, this is not the best book for you to be writing, at least while I'm working for you. But, as Tim will attest, LBJ also taped conversations with his wife over the telephone without her knowledge, which I recommend for any marriage. But the result is that you can actually hear him talking to Lady Bird, and he talked to her just beautifully. He would say things like, my darling, I long to see you. My wife took one listen to that and said, this is exactly the book you should be writing. Bird would talk a lot more the way that he did. But it really is a problem. I'll mention one more Johnson story before getting onto this one. But Johnson, another story that in Texas they say has the added advantage of being true. He was asking one of his aides to write a speech for him. The aide brought in the speech text. It was very long. And he looked at it and said, well, text is fine. Looks very good. But this opening quotation, as Aristotle said, blah, blah, blah. Johnson said, there's a problem. And he said, what's the problem? Well, as Johnson said, well, nobody in the audience is going to know who the hell Aristotle was. So just keep the quotation, but change it to, as my daddy said. As president, politically, my guess is, I don't need to ask Tim to tell you that for him and me, this would not do wonders for us as historians and practices. So that's what you have to do with this line of work. What this book is about, it's about 9, I should be really a good author and hold up the book, I'm not going to tell the price. 9 presidents, George Washington to Ronald Reagan, 200 years. And what I wanted to do was write the stories of these 9 presidents and choose moments in these presidencies where these presidents essentially looked into the abyss when there was an urgent national need or a crisis where they had to make a choice, and the choice was to do the right thing, even though it may have meant that they would lose their popularity or their re-election or their career or even in their life, as was the case with Abraham Lincoln. And the book opens in 1795, and the scene I've got is George Washington is at Mount Vernon. Probably a few people here have actually visited Mount Vernon. A lot of school field trips, family trips. Yeah, and you'll agree it's very well restored. It's just the way it did in 1795. And one night that August, Washington was there, and this is the scene I've got, and he was writing and was reading letters, and he was angry, and he was anxious, and he was tormented, and outside it was raining, and the WP's weather vane on top of the house was spinning around. And the reason he was so tormented was, for the first time in his life, huge numbers of Americans were furious at him, had contempt for him. They were writing angry letters saying you should be impeached, you should be assassinated. You know, we thought we knew you, we didn't. And the reason this was something that Washington had brought on himself. By his 6th year as president, he had become convinced that the British were possibly going to invade the United States and conquer us and end this country at the age of about 20 because he knew we couldn't resist such an invasion. So to keep that from happening and save the country, he did a treaty with the British, sent John Jay over, who came back with a treaty endorsed, called Jay's Treaty, that said the British would not invade, but it had things in it that many Americans found humiliating. They said, why do we have to go crawling toward the British, whom we just defeated, only a couple decades ago? And they blamed Washington, and they blamed Jay. Jay said that he could walk the entire length of the United States at night purely by the light of his burning effigies. And in one of the newspapers, there was a cartoon against Jay in Washington that showed Jay crawling to the British king, and I can't remember the words exactly, but it says something like, in lavish fashion, I surpass your majesty with my lavish kissing of your blank. Newspaper, but rhymed with surpass. And the thing was that this was the ordeal of Washington's life. He was used to going into a room and having the children's faces light up and people saying, there's the hero who unites all of our hearts. He had been elected president twice unanimously. All that was gone. He was heartbroken when he left the presidency, and his wife Martha thought that this ordeal hastened his premature death. So why did he do it? He could very well said, I've got a year and a half left in office, let my successor do it. He did it because he thought only with his prestige could he get Americans to accept this treaty, even though they were angry to save the country. And something even more profound, and that was that when Washington was president, he knew that everything he did was going to set a tradition for later presidents. And so he wanted to send a message to his successors, you're going to have to do as I did. I gave up my popularity. I went through hell to do something important for the country. He invented what I refer to as presidential courage. Said to his predecessors, you're not expected just to be popular. You may have to do something in a crisis at a certain moment that may give it all up. That's what a great leader is. The second president I write about is John Adams. I'll just skip through a few of these to keep the time. Adams was the leader of the party, the Federalists, that was desperate to go to war with France. And for a while, he was too, and he really got into it because secretly Adams was sort of jealous of George Washington's military reputation. And he began, when he gave a speech like this, he would wear a military uniform with this big silver sword gleaming at his side, and he really got into it. So this is, in a way, sort of pleasant, and I'm overcoming this indifference that many people have had toward me. And it was almost as if he was on a bender. And then at a certain moment, it was sort of a moment of stunning realization, almost as if he had woken up after a long night with a splitting headache saying, what have I done? France is attacking our ships on the Atlantic, but they're not an imminent threat. And he went to the leaders of his party and said, we're not going to war. He said, great is the guilt of an unnecessary war. We can't go to war unless there's an immediate threat. They were furious at it. They said, if you make peace with France, we're not going to support you, which they didn't. The result was that Adams lost re-election, had to go back to Massachusetts and lose her. Nowhere near the year of George Washington. But the key is, what he said to himself was, I hate to lose, it's painful, I wanted 2 terms as president, just like my predecessor, the great General Washington, but, I did it for a good cause, it was necessary to avert this war, and I can go back and I've got other things in my life. I've got my wife Abigail, and my children, and my wonderful farm in Massachusetts, and my books, my old friends from the Revolution, And he lived 26 more years, not happily, but it was enough for him. There were other things in his life. And I think that's another key to presidential courage, because we're all looking at these candidates this year and next, and one way to try to figure out, is this someone who would be courageous if necessary? Ask the question, is this someone who has other things in his or her life than just politics and getting the presidency and holding it? Are there family, are there other interests, and most importantly, are there larger convictions for which this leader might be willing to give it all up, as some of the presidents I've written about did? Andrew Jackson, 1828, was elected after a campaign that makes our Greek politics look pale in comparison. There were handbills against his cherished wife, Rachel, which called her an adulteress and a prostitute, which he succeeded in keeping away from her, but she accidentally saw one of them after the election. She collapsed, went into a severe decline, and died. She literally had been driven to her grave. So Jackson came to office full of revenge, eager to sort of get revenge against these political enemies, but also eager to conquer something called the Bank of the United States, which, hard to describe how powerful it was. It was a semi-public banking institution, had all sorts of power over government money, other things given to it by Congress, huge power over millions of Americans, their loans and their mortgages and so on. And also they had bribed a huge number of senators and members of Congress, members of the press, and so they and their leader Nicholas Biddle could do almost whatever they wanted. And so Jackson felt, as the first non-aristocrat as president, as a threat to our liberties, has to be stopped. And so when he went up against the bank and tried to abolish it, he could not know what the result would be. If the bank had this much hidden power, tentacles that went who knew where, they had the power to destroy it in the death struggle. The fact was he won. Abraham Lincoln, 1864, one of President Nixon's favorites. In the summer of 1864, I begin the story where Lincoln is in a little cottage about 3 miles north of the White House, which is to this day very well known, but is now being restored, will be opened early next year under the name Lincoln Cottage. It was sort of his Camp David, because in those days, a president's offices were upstairs in the White House, intermingled with the family bedroom. So every morning Lincoln would open his bedroom door wearing his long white nightshirt and stumble over 90 people who wanted jobs from him and favors or were angry about something he did. And so every summer, the earliest opportunity, he took his family up the hill to the cooler climes of his cottage and also to escape the tumult upstairs at the White House. And in August of 1864, he was in the parlor of his cottage, alone because his wife and children were gone. And his political aides came to him and said, "Mr. Lincoln, we regret to tell you you're going to lose re-election this fall against General McClellan. You're not even going to win your home state of Illinois." And the reason is that Northern voters were willing to fight the Civil War to bring the South back, but not to free the slaves. You issued this Emancipation Proclamation. A lot of them are angry at you. They think that you changed the signals. And the only way you're going to have a chance to get reelected is if you renounce the Emancipation, say you weren't serious. And I should say, I got into this line of work largely from an experience I had when I was about 8. Growing up in Illinois, even in Cook County, people have these instincts. People were very much acolytes of Abraham Lincoln, even those, especially those growing up in Republican households in the early 1960s, the time of the Civil War centennial. So when I was 8, my parents took me down to Springfield, and I saw Lincoln's house. And as I remember, I was taken to Lincoln's parlor, and they showed me the chair that Lincoln had sat in reading to his boys. And I remember I asked one of the guys, when Lincoln's boys were bad, did he spank them? And the guy was really disgusted. He said, "No, Lincoln didn't believe in discipline, just let these kids run wild through the house." And I heard that, and Lincoln was the man for me. I read everything to get my hands on Lincoln, and that had a lot to do with my wanting to write history books about presidents later on. So given my view of Abraham Lincoln at that age, I would have thought that if someone had said, you know, you have to cancel the Emancipation Proclamation, get reelected, Lincoln would say, absolutely not, I wouldn't dream of doing such a thing. But the fact was, he said, let me think. And the thing about all these presidents I've written about is that, you know, they are not saints. Every single one of them had worked hard to become president. They didn't want to give it all up, humanly. Most of them had a devil on one shoulder, an angel on the other. And for a while, Lincoln was thinking about the devil. You know, maybe I can find some legalistic way to say that I really didn't mean it about the emancipation. But it didn't take him long to figure out that was not the right thing to do. And in this, he was not very much helped by his wife. I mean, a lot of these stories are about marriages. Mary Lincoln, unbeknownst to Lincoln, had behind his back run up these enormous clothing and furniture bills. And so she owed a lot of money to people in Washington. And she was terrified that if Lincoln lost re-election, the next day all these people would be on the White House doorstep saying, hey, you're leaving so we want our money. And she thought they would have to go back to Illinois bankrupt, which is actually possible. So without telling her husband any of this, she just said, well, maybe it's very important for you to do something to win the election. Maybe you should think about distancing yourself from this promise to free the slaves. But despite all that, in the end, he said essentially, I can't be Abraham Lincoln and walk away from this. Plus, my place in history, he said, is probably going to be as the liberator of the race. So he did the right thing. With the help of General Sherman reaching Atlanta, he won re-election as it turned out. But in the end, he paid a higher price because he paid with his life. Remember, John Wilkes Booth, the reason Booth killed Lincoln was because he hated him for freeing the slaves. That was his presidential courage. Theodore Roosevelt, 1901, became president quickly after the assassination of McKinley, leader of a party that was very much oriented toward Wall Street and J.P. Morgan, and TR was known as a radical cowboy reformer and scarecrow. So if he'd done the political thing, he would have said to these party leaders, you know, you've had me wrong all these years, I was really William McKinley in disguise. But instead what he did, almost the first major thing he did as president was he went after Morgan and he sued to dissolve the world's largest trust, which was dominated by Morgan, and said to Wall Street, you better beware because I think you've been doing some bad things in the last 20 years. Did so at the risk of losing the nomination of his party in 1904, however desperate he was to become president in his own right, not just by assassination. And the key to it was, on election night 1904, TR had voted on Long Island and signed a memorial, took the train to Washington, and there standing in the doorway of the White House was his smiling wife, Edith, to whom he was very close. And he said to her, you know, Edith, I've had a vision on the train, and the vision was of you and our children, these wonderful children. He used to say, I feel each of them in a different way as my special friend, and they feel the same way about me. And he said, you know, I'm eager to win the election tonight, but it doesn't work out. You know, we have each other, and we have our children, and TR had his wonderful friends, you know, Buffalo Bill and Rudyard Kipling, and he liked to box and ranch in the Dakotas and write some history, and he would have been okay. And that's what he knew. And that's the quality that I'm talking about. You have to have presidents who have something else in their lives. FDR in 1940 was running for a third term at a time when this country was 70% isolationist. And his campaign advisor said, Mr. President, you want to get reelected, I suggest you not talk about building up our defense and possibly fighting Adolf Hitler because you'll lose. And Roosevelt replied with great principle, there's a worse alternative, and that is if I don't start to build our defense, I'll be the last president of the United States because if we have to go to war, that would be a war we lose, and that would be the end of the United States. 1948, Harry Truman, I write about Truman and the creation of Israel. And it shows, among other things, you know, all the different cross pressures on a president in a situation like this. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, said essentially, you do this, I will blast you and maybe resign. Truman was terrified. It was an election year, he didn't want to lose General Marshall, he said. His wife Bess, it turns out, sadly, I had not known this before, did not allow Jewish people in her house in Independence, Missouri. Remember the old talk show host David Susskind? He was interviewing Truman in his retirement. I think it was 1961. He said, Mr. President, each day I come to pick you up at the house and you never invite me in. And Truman said, well, David, you're Jewish, and this is Bess's house. There's never been a Jewish guest inside as long as I've lived. And then on the other side, is Truman had this old business partner, A. Jacobson, you know, with whom he had this failed haberdashery in Kansas City, 1920s. And Jacobson appears in the Oval Office at a crucial moment with tears streaming down his face saying, Harry, I've never asked you for a favor, but my people are suffering and they're Holocaust survivors. still in camps in Germany, of all places. We have to resist possibly Hitler. Please do so. Had a big influence on Truman. But in the end, you have to figure what really helped him to resolve this huge cacophony. I found that one important influence was, and again, I expect to hear this from Tim or me, but he was a history reader. And when he was a kid, he had these Coke bottle glasses, and his family was so poor, they said, Harry, you can't do sports because if they're broken, we don't have the money to replace them. So he spent his time reading just about every book at the Independence Public Library. And one of those he remembered the most was a book with the very politically incorrect title of Great Men and Famous Women. That could be great, just famous. The subtitle was From Nebuchadnezzar to Sarah Bernhardt. He didn't remember the chapters on Nebuchadnezzar, but what he did remember was the story of Cyrus the Great, who was the Persian king who assembled the Jews in Zion in a famous biblical story 2,000 years earlier. And so that helped him to see that sort of like Lincoln with being the liberator of the race, this might be his place in history. And after he was president, he was with Eddie Jacobson in a group in New York, and Jacobson introduced him to the crowd saying, here's President Truman who helped create the state of Israel. And Truman almost pushed him aside and said, what do you mean help create? I am Cyrus. I am Cyrus. It moved him deeply in his later years. John Kennedy in 1960. I write about John Kennedy and civil rights, and there's a photograph in the book, which I guess I think I were a good bookmarker that I would have this ready to hold it up, but I'm not a very good bookmarker, so I'll tell you about it. There's a picture of Jackie Robinson and Richard Nixon, which was taken in 1960. And I guess you could play the game, what is this picture and why is it doing? Well, what is it doing here? Jackie Robinson was the most famous African American at the time, a great baseball hero. And he was a Republican, and he was a very devoted supporter of Richard Nixon because he felt that Richard Nixon's record on civil rights had been excellent in the late 1950s. And he was contrasting that record with Richard Nixon's opponent, John Kennedy. And what Robinson remembered was, he was absolutely right, in the late 1950s, John Kennedy for a long time thought that he would win the Democratic nomination in 1960 by courting white segregationist governors in the South, who still had huge power in the Democratic Party. A lot of delegates, people like John Patterson of Alabama, who lost to George Wallace, or who won over George Wallace in 1958 because he was more segregationist than George Wallace was. Kennedy had him for breakfast in his house in Georgetown, got his endorsement. Kennedy hoped that these things would remain sort of quiet, but they became very well known quickly through the black community. So that around 1958 and afterwards, Kennedy wrote to Martin Luther King asking for a meeting. King wouldn't even reply to the letter. And there was a banquet in New York. Kennedy saw Jackie Robinson, said, Jackie, come over here, let's have a picture taken together. Jackie took one look and turned his back and stalked away. Didn't want his picture taken with Kennedy because he felt that, and rightly so, at that time, Kennedy was playing footsie with the segregationists. Things, went on. There was a long story in 1960 of the campaign, which I won't take the time to go into, but the result of that was that John Kennedy ultimately won 80 to 90% of the black vote in 1960. On the promise, he had changed almost 100 degrees, that, if I'm elected president, I will end discrimination, he said, with the stroke of a pen. But by the spring of 1961, black Americans and others who were eager for civil rights were sending Kennedy ballpoint pens in the mail because it wasn't doing. And the reason he wasn't was Kennedy was elected narrowly. And he took a look at Congress, an awful lot of white segregationist Southern committee chairmen in the Democratic Party, House and Senate. Plus, he took a look at the states that had won an election in 1960, a lot of Southern states by very big margins. Anyone want to take a guess, what was the state in 1960 that went for Kennedy by the largest majority? I will not put Tim on the spot, he's about such trivia. The answer is Georgia by 66%. And those were not black voters because very few black people were allowed to vote, and they were not civil rights voters, they were segregationists, and Kennedy knew it. So he hoped to essentially turn his back on the black voters who had voted for him, renege on his promises, and he hoped to get through a whole term as president doing very little for civil rights, please the Southerners in Congress, get reelected with the help of the South, and then maybe in 1965 you might feel secure enough to send a civil rights bill to Congress saying that hotels and restaurants should be integrated. Simple as that. But as they say, events intervened. Martin Luther King was furious and put pressure on Kennedy by leading demonstrations, mainly in the South, so that by the spring of 1963 there were riots in Birmingham, and Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General, had to go to his brother and say, Jack, this is the time, unless you send a civil rights bill to Congress, the cities of the South and the North this summer probably will go up in flame, and people are going to say, why isn't the president doing something to get this revolution out of the streets into the courts? So with enormous reluctance, Kennedy sent this bill to Congress. Immediately, his support in the South almost evaporated overnight. And he began to think if the Republicans nominated a moderate like Richard Nixon in 1964, there'd be a good chance that he might be beaten by a Republican. In fact, the Republican he was most worried about in 1964 was a governor of Michigan whose son went on to do other things named George Romney. He thought that Romney could get a lot of votes in the North, and also he'd be probably slightly Kennedy's right on civil rights, so he could get many of these southern states that were for Kennedy in 1960. But the point is, Kennedy, who had made his way on the basis of his book, Profiles of Courage, it was basically a profile of cowardice for about 2.5 years, in the end did the right thing because he was pushed, but did the right thing and took a big political risk. And he finally said to Bobby, it's going to hurt to lose and go down. This may be my swan song. I write all this in the book, but if I have to go down, at least I'll go down with something as important as civil rights. That's what you want to do from the president. And the final story I tell is the story of Ronald Reagan. And what he did to help end the Cold War. And again, I don't want to keep on putting words in Timothy's mouth, but I think for a historian, it's when you get into sources that people did not get to use very much before, you can tell a story in a different way and really get inside these presidents' heads. And in Reagan's case, there were many people in the late 80s who thought, Reagan is doing almost a 180, First term, he was building up against the Soviets. Some people were worried that things were getting so tense that there was a danger of a world war. And now he's gone to the other extreme and is dealing with Mikhail Gorbachev. Where did this all come from? And I found that it was actually something that was profound in his life and almost invisible at the time. He had a mother named Nell, who was a lay preacher in Illinois, whom he loved and was very close to, very influenced by. And she thought, when she learned about them in the late 1940s, that atomic and nuclear weapons were immoral. And she said, Ronnie, if you're ever in a position to do something to stop these awful things, you should. And that really stuck with him, although she died in 1962. So that in 1981, when he was shot, almost died, he writes in his diary, God has spared me for a purpose, and the purpose must be to abolish nuclear weapons. And then in 1984, another woman intervened by the name of Nancy Reagan. She was worried that the buildup with the Soviets was getting dangerous geopolitically, and she also was worried that it might jeopardize his re-election, especially among people who liked Reagan otherwise, but were nervous about this aspect. And so she began to push him to try to negotiate. And she brought into the Oval Office a third woman, and that's a woman named Suzanne Massey, who is a writer, wrote a wonderful book on Russian culture called Land of the Firebird. And what Nancy Reagan hoped was that Suzanne Massey would tell Ronnie about the Russian soul, how you connect with Russians, if there's a Russian leader who wants to negotiate, how you deal with him. So then comes Mikhail Gorbachev. Suzanne Massey saw Reagan for about probably 3 or 4 dozen times, always did before his summits with Gorbachev, saying, this is how you begin trust, this is how you create a relationship. And maybe one of the keys is that Suzanne Massey, to whom Reagan was so attached, she reminded him of his mother. So really almost returned full circle. But in the end, the result of all this was that when Ronald Reagan took some risks to end the Cold War, some of the people who were most upset by this were people who had supported him for years, who thought, what's happened to our Ronnie? We thought we liked the Ronnie that built up against the Soviets, but Gorbachev may turn out to be some new Brezhnev with a smiling face. He's getting taken in. Some of them call him a useful idiot. And the thing is that Reagan had the spine and the belief in what he was saying to say,
I think Gorbachev is for real. I think this is a moment that we can end the Cold War. It would be immoral of me not to seize it, and so he did. And the final scene I have in that story is that Reagan and Gorbachev met for the last time as leaders, end of 1988. He leave office on Governor's Island in the river just off New York. And so by then they were friends, and they had a great meeting. Then they went out, stood on a platform for a photo opportunity, and you could see the pictures as Reagan and Gorbachev, and Reagan is motioning at the New York skyline. He's so proud of you, this is what America can do. And the final thing he points at, you can see in these pictures, as one in the book is, he points at the largest building on the New York skyline, the World Trade Center. It's almost as if he's opening the next chapter of American history. So that's pretty much the book. And as I say, the point I'm trying to make with it is to say that if you go through 200 years and tell the story as I have, you see that without presidential courage, we don't end the Cold War, don't win World War II, we don't win the Civil Wars we did, and a lot of other things. And I close it by saying, that's what every president has to remember, and if he or she doesn't, take them to Mount Vernon, where I'm glad a lot of you have been, and you can go into that study where Washington was sitting, remember that night in 1795, the rain falling and scratching out all those letters. Or even better yet, take the new president up the stairs in Washington's bedroom, which is also well preserved. You can see the bed in which Washington died. And about at the end of the book, I say that just about his last words were 3 words. He was looking up into the kindly worried face of his doctor, but I think I'd like to think that he was almost sending a message to all of us later Americans and later presidents. And those 3 words he spoke were, don't be afraid. Thank you all very much.
At what point in your life did you choose to be a historian, and how did that happen? It's not exactly a popular occupation.
Yeah, no, growing up in Illinois, I didn't know too many other kids who were as wonkish as I was. A lot of it had to do with, after that trip to Springfield, I really did read like the golden books and landmark biographies of Lincoln and other presidents. And the other thing is that this would have been maybe 63 or 64, 65. And if you were a kid growing up, especially at a moment like that, you would have got the impression from the outer world that presidents were pretty important people in your lives. I was about 7 at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I can remember seeing Kennedy on TV, and I didn't understand every aspect of the crisis that Tim has written about so well. But I did have the sense that we were really going to be in danger for a few days. And I remember, anyone here from the Midwest? So a couple of people where you have tornadoes, and especially for kids, it's pretty frightening. A couple of days during the summer, there's a tornado warning, you go down to the cellar for a few hours, and you don't know when you come up with there'll be a house there, or whether a tree will come to your living room. And so that was what the Cuban Missile Crisis was like for me. I thought this was going to be a time of danger, and who knew whether we'd be alive by the end of the week. That was something that even kids understood. And then a couple of years later, I think I was in summer camp, and again, this is embarrassing to admit, I was the only kid in this camp who had an error subscription to the Chicago Tribune. I arrived 2 days late. You can imagine that was a lot of fun to be a But, you looked at the front page every day. It looked to me as if the same picture of Lyndon Johnson every day, was there with a lot of guys, signing a piece of paper. And what it was every day they had a picture of them signing some new bill, part of the Great Society, voting rights or Medicare or something like that. So to the extent that this penetrates to a child, I thought, these lives were actually pretty interesting, and they must have a big influence in the lives of other Americans. So that's why I got particularly interested. Thank you.
Michael, thanks for showing up. I really appreciate it.
My showing up was never in question. I didn't go into a bar or anything like that.
I don't know if history will bear me out, but it seems that the second terms of presidents, you wait for the shoe to fall. Do you think it's time for...
Are you saying that particularly in this library? Happens to almost every second term president in the last 60 years.
Do you think it's time for a one-term, 6-year president?
It would be a way of fixing this, but I think it might be throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because one problem is, it does avoid the second term curse, as you're saying,
But I have a huge feeling about accountability, and I sure, as much as I like presidential courage, and by that I mean, you know, a president for an important cause telling Americans there's something I think you should do that you may not at first like, but then persuading them. And I might add that of the 9 presidents whose stories I tell, only Adams lost re-election because he was clueless as a politician, and to some extent I think he deliberately did it to himself because he thought, if I'm defeated for making peace with France, I'll finally convince myself that I'm a good person, which he was always worried about. I would really worry about a 6-year term where a president has absolutely no accountability in terms of re-election from the moment that he or she comes to power, so that would make me very nervous. But it is a problem the second term occurs. Yes, sir.
I'm currently teaching a course in American presidency at Cal State Fullerton.
Oh, super.
And
I hope I haven't made any mistakes yet.
repeatedly I've been asked by adults, sophomore adults, said that, who do you think was the best president and why? And I've given various things about, but who do you think was the best
Well, let me
president?
ask you first.
Who do you think was the best president and why?
But you have to tell first.
Well, I give evidence for Theodore Roosevelt.
Really? Why?
Courage and leadership and leading America into the 20th century.
I think that's all good, but I don't think it quite gets up. Did everyone hear that? Theodore Roosevelt? I don't think it quite gets up to the level of George Washington having the character to found this country and get the government started, or Abraham Lincoln saving the Union. And I'd probably put FDR a couple notches down. I think most historians would probably give these choices, but you know, I did put TR in the book, so we're not that far apart. Yes, ma'am? No.
Oh, I'm sorry. You told a story about Bess Truman, about not allowing Jews to have. Was it not true that it was her parents' home, and it was her parents that had the philosophy as opposed to Bess?
Yeah, but my parents have some philosophies too. And, I mean, her mother was long gone. This was 1961.
Okay.
And it's sort of poignant because this Eddie Jacobson I was talking about was a very close friend of Truman, not only his business partner, but before then they were Army buddies. They run a canteen together. And when Jacobson died, Truman went to the family and cried. I have it in the book saying, I lost my brother. They were very close. But Mrs. Jacobson virtually never met Mrs. Truman. The Jacobson daughters never met Margaret Truman. And they were very much hurt by this. So it was a, you know, I think in Harry Truman's case, Bess was an extremely strong woman, and this was her family house, and this is one case among many where he did not cross her.
How do you rate James K. Polk? He completed the Northwest Territory, and he completed Manifest Destiny, the whole Southern Territory, and had 2 successful domestic programs. How would you rate him as one of the great presidents?
Yeah, very high. And in terms of James K. Polk, forgive this inside baseball of ours, but had a number of things that he wanted to do and did it. And also in terms of what you were saying, resolved not to run for re-election, so he didn't have to have the yoke of public opinion on him all the time. So I think he could have been in maybe a 3-volume version of this book. Maybe not 2 or 3. Only because it, you know, not quite at the level of Civil War or some big sort of life-changing events. But good point, thank you.
Well, this is up to you, Mr. Sure. One more question. It seems to me that some of our great presidents would not be electable.
Totally. Totally right. And I even make some of our great presidents would not be elected today. I even define it more narrowly. I would say they could not be nominated. And I detest the system that is involved in nominating presidents. I think you wouldn't use it to hire a middle manager in any organization you know of. Because what you're basically saying is that presidential candidate can't be serious unless they raise $100 million. This is all going to happen very fast, probably by midnight on the 5th of February. And, you know, I hate to always say this because, you know, historians always seem to prefer it the way it was. You know, a bad historian's joke I wouldn't inflict on Tim, but you know, how many historians to change the light bulb, one to change the light bulb, the other 2 to reminisce about the old light bulb. like the one that nominated Richard Nixon in 1960 or 1968. You began with New Hampshire primary, a little bit later on in time, you have an Iowa caucus before that, and then some other primaries and conventions, and you get to Oregon by about May, and California primary in June. And you had about 6 months to look at these candidates and see how they recovered from defeat, what they said when they were tired. If a dark horse won the New Hampshire primary, you had a couple of weeks to raise money so that he would have a chance. And so we Americans would get to vet these people in all sorts of different situations and from all sorts of different sides. That has all been completely taken away. If Andrew Jackson had to raise $100 million from rich donors, there's no way he could stop the bank in the United States. So I wouldn't worry about any of these presidents in this book getting nominated under the process that we've got about it. I hope we survive it. Can I say one more word? Well, I'll make it really brief because I was saying at the beginning that we sometimes resemble guys we write about, and I should have warned you at the beginning. One of the people I've written about is Hubert Humphrey, who spoke in increments of 3 hours. And he once was doing this, he was on about hour 4, and he finally yells out, anyone in the crowd got a watch? And someone yelled back, how about a calendar or something?